share my screen with some opening prayers, and then I'll also share it for the actual text that we're going to go over today. But before I start, does anybody have any opening questions? I always can count on Jackie to ask me questions. No, nothing. Okay, all right. And that's fine. And by the way, I'm very comfortable with people asking questions right in the middle of when I'm talking. In fact, I think it helps everybody, because usually if you have a question, then lots of people will have it. So feel free to jump in. Okay, so let me see about sharing the screen. Here we go. Okay, you can see my launch meeting screen. All right, but what I want you to see is the opening prayer. Does everybody see it? We're good?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's start with the mandala. Sashibogi Juji Medo Tan Rira Linjin Yinde Gemba Dia Sange Jindu Meda Wagi Dudu Nanda Jinga Juba Jo Idon Guru Rana Mandala Kamne Yatayami Sange Judan Zogi Jonam La Janju Badu Dani Yazuji Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benje Sange Duba Jo Sange Dani Yazuji Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benje Sange Duba Jo Sange Judan Zogi Jonam La Janju Badu Dani Yazuji Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benje Sange Duba Jo. You know, sentient beings have happiness and the cause of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings find a happiness that is beyond all suffering. And may all beings abide in equanimity without attachment or aversion to those held near or far. Okay, so that sets the ground. The text we're going over today is famous. I'm sure if you haven't heard it, you'll hear it lots of times, right? I've heard it from all my teachers. It's part of, in Tibetan Buddhism, just to give you a framework, I'm sure most of you have it, but most of the teachings that are described by great teachers come down from two lineages. One lineage of teaching came from the Buddha to his direct disciple Maitreya, who's the future Buddha. And then from Maitreya, it came to an earthly disciple named Asanga. And then from Asanga, it came down from different lineage lamas, eventually to Joel Atisha, who lived in the 10th century into the 11th century. Joel Atisha brought these teachings to Tibet, and then he taught them to his disciple Drumtumje. Drumtumje taught them to 4 disciples, 3 of whom are called the Kadampa Geshes, the 3 Kadampa Geshe brothers. Then one of them was very famous. His name was Potawa Rinchen Sel, and he taught them to Langri Tampa Dorje Senge. That was his main disciple. And he's the one who wrote these 8 verses. So Langri Tampa Dorje Senge was born in 1054, the same year that Atisha passed away. Now another lineage came down from the Buddha, and then Buddha taught a special lineage on how to develop compassionate insight to Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And then Manjushri taught those teachings to Shantideva, the famous bodhisattva who wrote the Bodhicharya Avatara, Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And then from Shantideva, they came down from different lineage lamas in a secret tradition called the tradition of exchanging self for others. And that tradition came to Joe Atisha as well. Joe Atisha had three main teachers, Dharmarakshita, Maitri Yogi, and Lama Serlingpa. And these teachings were mainly from Lama Serlingpa. And Atisha brought those secretly into Tibet and secretly passed them to Drumtumje. Again, his main disciple, Drumtumje. And Drumtumje passed them to the four Kadampa Geshes, the three brothers, Potawa Rinchen Sel. And Potawa Rinchen Sel only taught these to two disciples. One was Geshe Langri Tangpa, and the other he taught it to was Geshe Sharawa. So Geshe Sharawa was another great lineage lama, another great teacher. So anyway, the reason they were secret is that they're so profound. They're so profound that they don't fit the minds of most people. You have to have a really big heart and really be sharp, right, to really understand them. And so what happened is Langri Tangpa, who got these teachings, put them into these 8 verses. He didn't write out the actual whole tradition of exchanging self for others because it was still being taught secretly from teacher to disciple. And what happened was after Langri Tangpa died, after he passed, there was a Geshe named Chikawa, and he was in another part of Tibet, and he heard somebody reciting these 8 verses, and he just became enthralled with them. I mean, he couldn't, he was like, where did these come from? I have to find out who taught these, and so he went searching to find who taught them. And as he was searching for Langri Tangpa, Geshe Langri Tangpa, of course, in Tibet in those days, they didn't have any Hilton hotels or any, not even Hotel 6. It was pretty rough and rustic, but there was a custom among the Tibetans that if you knocked on their door and you were a wanderer, they would let you stay the night. However, even though it was very hospitable that way, a lot of people didn't particularly like people coming by their door asking to stay. And so sometimes they give you a really rough place to sleep, or they'd really be rude to you, or they would give you all these tough chores to do because they were kind of mad at you. And so he found these 8 verses incredibly helpful to turn those situations into the path, right? And so, so by the time he got to where Langri Tangpa had a monastery and had taught, Langri Tangpa had passed away. And so he was just heartbroken that he couldn't hear this directly from Geshe Langri Tangpa. However, Geshe Sharawa was still alive. Remember, that was the second disciple that Potawa Rinchen Sel taught these teaching to. And so as Geshe Chikawa heard the actual tradition of exchanging self for others, he realized that besides Geshe Sharawa, he was the last living person on earth to know these teachings. And he became frightened that they would be lost. And so he wrote them down in the now famous tradition of the 7-point mind training. And that's how we have these teachings. So that's a little bit of the background. There are lots of stories about Geshe Langri Tangpa that are beautiful. He was considered an emanation of Buddha Amitabha. And he just an amazing disciple, very humble, very sincere. In fact, he was so sincere that his face was always, he always looked like he was depressed, right? And so they called him Blackface because he was always walking around next to tears and like this. We know most people who are like that, um, it's because they're mad and angry and disappointed that life isn't giving them what they want. Is the complete opposite for him. He was completely realized internally, but there was so much suffering in the world, and he felt such deep compassion for everybody that he was constantly like that. um, but anyway, his teacher, Boto Rinchinsel, told him that it would be good if he just gave up a householder's life and he was just a wanderer. And so he would kind of wander in and out of different places, helping beings wherever he went and teaching and so forth. There's one story where he came to a place where he was doing what's called a puja, which is a ritual way to please the lineage lamas and to get virtue and to help beings. And he was making a ritual cake called a torma. And so this torma was on a little plate, and a crow swooped down and grabbed the plate and took the torma up in the air and dropped the plate on a mountain. And so he went to that mountain. He retreated for 3 years, did a 3-year retreat on that mountain. And afterwards, he came down, and there was a similar thing with a crow grabbing a ritual implement and dropping it. And on the site that the crow dropped the ritual items, he built a monastery. And then he started teaching in that monastery, and monks would come, and he became quite renowned as an incredible teacher. One story that was really interesting is one time he was teaching, and of course he was a monk. He was teaching this big crowd of people, and this woman entered with a little baby. And she walked up to his throne and she said, "This baby is yours." The baby. And you can't imagine in terms of like how humiliating that would be for a monk who's a teacher, in front of a congregation. And the backstory is the reason she did that. She had had several children who had died. And so when this child was born, a soothsayer told her that the way the child would live would be if she gave the child to the care of a monk. And she knew that Geshe Langye Trungpa was a very kind monk, and so she thought her child would be safest with him. But nobody in the audience knew this. When she walked in with the baby and she handed, "Here's your child." Right? So what he did is he just kindly took the child, continued his teaching, and was nurturing the child. And he found a wet nurse nearby, and he had her kind of do some of the care of the child. After a couple of years, when the child had grown and was healthy, and the mother realized that her child was going to survive, she came back and demanded her child back. And so of course, he kindly gave back the child, who by this point was in good shape. But that's the kind of person he was. Very unassuming, very kind. It's said that when he passed away, during the cremation, in the sky, everybody could see this array of rainbows. There was a rain of flowers, and it said that this beautiful fragrance filled the air. And then afterwards, in the cremation pyre, there were all sorts of relics that they found. And so he was a great Lama. And so it's really lucky to hear the teachings, that they're still here and that we could still practice them. When I heard these teachings, I was a bit disappointed because I was an aspiring jazz musician in University of California at Santa Cruz, and I felt rather good about myself. And so I heard these teachings. They were incredibly humbling. And I realized that I had been on the completely wrong path my whole life. And so I had to really do a lot of work to get myself on the right path. And I was sincere, I was really trying. And so my mom, you know, she gave me this teacup. Can everybody see this? Gary Larson cartoon. There's a deer with a target on his stomach, and the other deer saying, "Bummer the birthmark, Hal." So that was my mother's gift to me because she was worried that I was so kind of sincerely trying to do this. She didn't know why. My mom didn't know why. I didn't really tell her much about it, but anyway, I found this poem incredibly inspiring. So that's kind of the background. Um, to actually understand this poem, you have to understand the tradition of exchanging and equalizing self for others. There are 5 major points in it. The first point is that oneself is equal to others. Oneself and others are equal. And this is a very easy to realize point.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I think your microphone is maybe a little bit displaced. So we're losing some of the audio, just a little.
Okay, if you can hold for a second, I'll put on a headset.
Terrific.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully this will work.
Much better. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, but I haven't even plugged it in yet. Plug it in. Okay.
Hear me? Is that better?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Good. Okay. All right. So in these 8 verses, I was saying that there are 5 main points in the tradition of exchanging self for others. And the first point being oneself and others are equal. And the way that we're equal, I do this in my classes at George Mason. I teach social work. And so we get into diversity and injustice and racism and all that kind of stuff. And I'll ask my classes, which are quite diverse in terms of gender and belief and race and everything else, culture. I'll say, is everybody here equal or is everybody here different? And they'll all say, we're all different. Right? Of course, can't you see? Kind of thing. And I'll say, okay, who here wants to suffer? And nobody will raise their hand. And I'll say, who here wants to be happy and respected? And everybody puts up their hand. That's happened for years, right? And we all know this. Nobody wants to suffer. Nobody wants to be disrespected. Nobody wants to be poor or run into bad situations, right? We all want respect, love. We want to have enough wealth. We want to be secure. We want happiness, right? And so that level of feelings, we're all equal. Even a bug, you can tell if you see a bug and you put your finger near it, it'll freak out. No, don't squash me, right? It's exactly the same. It's trying to find food, it's trying to find well-being. And so we share that trait with all of life. Everybody is totally equal. So you have to have that perspective as kind of a basis, even before you get to the first verse of this poem. The second thing you have to have, the second point of the 5 major points in exchanging self for others is rongcheisen ki kyun, the faults of just cherishing yourself. I'll just tell you the 5 points so you know what's coming. There's Dakshin Yampa, which is self and others are equal. Then Ranche Jinki Kun means that just cherishing yourself, there are a lot of faults to it. Third one is Shenche Zenki Yunten, the good qualities of exchanging of the good qualities of cherishing others. And then the fourth point is Tonglen, giving and taking. No, I'm sorry. The fourth point is Dakchen Yamje, which means exchanging self for others. And the fifth point is Tonglen, giving and taking practice. So all of those are included in these 8 verses. But you have to get to that second point of realizing the faults of cherishing yourself even before you begin the first verse. So let's talk about that a little bit. Anybody know the Western writer Ayn Rand? Some people know. She wrote
Yes.
Atlas Shrugged, and she had a philosophy called rational egoism. And her tenet was that, first of all, she dismissed all religious thought as just bunk. And she said, you have to come to your senses, you have to see what's real, what's not real. And she said that empathy is for stooges, basically. That's just something people tell you to take advantage of you, kind of thing. And that the only rational thing to do would be to look out for your own interests, right? And so we have that kind of philosophy, and it's very popular among certain political beliefs and stuff like that. So we have that kind of as a backdrop in our culture. But is it true? Is it true that you got to be a fool unless you're looking out for your own interests? What do you think? You have to be really clear on this point, or you're not going to get the profound instruction stream. Okay. I'll tell you from a Buddhist point of view. From a Buddhist point of view, this is just one life of many. Every morning we get up, we put on a new set of clothes. Similarly, from a Buddhist view, every time we're born, it's like putting on a new set of clothes. Then by the time it gets evening time, the clothes are kind of soiled and we're happy to get rid of them, right? Similarly, in life, by the time we're old, like my body's getting really old now and I got all sorts of medical things. And I remember my teacher, one of the teachers who, in fact, I'm using his commentary, Samurai Kenzer Rinpoche's commentary to the 8 verses. He was an incredible teacher. When he got near the end of his life, he used to go, I need a new one. Talking about his body, because it was getting, he had diabetes and all sorts of issues. So he wanted to get out of his old model and into a new one. And so sleep is a little bit like death. We do it every day. We lose ourselves, right? Dreams are a little bit like the intermediate state between lives. And then waking up in the morning is a little bit like being born into another body. Now, you might, if you're a Westerner, you have every reason to doubt this because we're taught that, well, we do have religious traditions, but those mostly say God made us and we have one chance to redeem ourselves, or it's into hell for us or into heaven, right? But the main kind of scientific thrust is that our minds are our brains. And so when our brains die, so does the mind, and that's it. It's kaput for us, right? We're done. And if you're rational, you have to believe it because you can see that when the brain dies, that's it. However, is that really true? Just because we can't see the mind doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We can't see Wi-Fi, And yet, look what's happening now. We're talking to each other from miles away, right? With something we can't even see. Wi-Fi. Anybody want to assert that Wi-Fi doesn't exist? It obviously does, right? And so, same with the mind. Um, the mind has different levels of subtlety and coarseness. It's not the same substance as the body. Physical things can't feel. Physical things like the computer doesn't have cognition. Physical things can't discern and categorize. The computer categorizes, but it's because of zeros and ones, and right. It's not having the cognitive set that we have, right? So mind has different qualities than matter. We can see it, we can look for it, and we can see it. This moment of mind has to come from a substance that's of a similar nature. Dharmakirti, a philosopher, a Buddhist philosopher who lived, I think, in 600 Common Era, he said that the relationship between body and mind is like the relationship between fire and lead. Right? If you put lead into fire, there's definitely a relationship. They interact, right? But they're of different substances, right? The fire can't become lead, lead can't become fire, right? But they interact with each other. Similarly, when we take birth into our mother's womb, there need to be three ingredients: the substance from the father, the unique substance from the mother, and a mental continuum. When those three come together, you get the fetus, you get life, right? But that moment when mind starts to interact with the ovum, you have to ask, where did that moment of mind come from? And from Dharmakirti's point of view, it had to come from a previous moment of something of a similar substance, which must have been of a mental nature, which is how you establish the Bardo being. Where did that mind come from? Must come from a previous mind. Where did that come from? From a previous. So you can't assert from a Buddhist point of view any beginning. How does this impact this verse? From a selfish point of view, everything we do for this life, trying to amass wealth, trying to get famous, trying to have all the pleasant sensations we can have, trying to only hear good things about ourselves, right? All those things that we strive for. What does it really do for us in the long term? Take our former president, right? He did all that work to try to keep power, he even tried to foment an insurrection to try to keep power. Where did it leave him? Right? All those actions that were done, from neglecting the pandemic, which led to 400,000 plus deaths, to all the divisiveness, it depends on his motive. If they were done, and he believes in Ayn Rand, by the way, that's one of the philosophers that he prescribes to. If he did all those things just to aggrandize himself, which it appears that he did, all of that was bad deeds from a Buddhist point of view. All of that was negative karma. So when he dies, and his mind is shaped by the karma into what he's going to become, what do you think that's going to bring him? I'm really terribly worried about the guy, right? I really am. I think it's going to be horrible. And that's why Langi Trunkpa was always sad. You know, you'd see these people who are doing all these horrible things, trying to be happy in the moment, but knowing what it was going to bring them. It was going to bring them nothing but incredible pain. It was causing them pain in the moment, and it was causing everybody around them to suffer. And yet people are completely blind to it. They don't know. They don't know that their actions are going to bring consequences to them, and that just cherishing the self and not caring about anybody else doesn't help you at all. It's going to cause you incredible suffering. That's all it can do. The interesting thing is that a lot of empirical studies about narcissism are bearing out what this tradition says. Narcissists have more problems with anger. They have a real hard time keeping friends. They have more heart failure than people who are less narcissistic. Being compassionate is good for your vagal nerve in your heart, right? So narcissism, in fact, goes against our own biology. It hurts our health. People are more narcissistic, get edgy. They tend to have more problems with car accidents because they're so impulsive. They tend to take risk in their lifestyle, more drug abuse, sexual acting out, all sorts of social problems. Tend to end up more isolated because nobody wants to be around them after a while, right? And so, what's the good in just cherishing yourself? It doesn't help you in this life, and it really destroys your future lives. So have I convinced you? Does anybody want to debate me on this part? But you have to really be kind of like a scientist to look at narcissism because it's very compelling. It tries to convince us, hey, I'm your friend, right? You got to trust me. But in fact, while it feels like it's our ally, it's our worst enemy, and it has been our worst enemy from beginningless time. The only reason we're not enlightened yet is that we've been listening to our narcissism instead of our compassion. So those are the backdrop that you need to get to the first verse. Geshe Langvitampa, for each of these verses, he wrote a little instruction that goes along with the verse. His instruction for this first verse is cultivate the view that all sentient beings are extremely kind. That's his opening line for this first verse. And this first verse goes into that third point of exchanging self for others. Remember, it's self and others are equal. Think of the faults of just cherishing the self, which we just did. Third point, think of the good things that come from cherishing others. And so the first four verses are towards that third point of exchanging self for others. So here's the verse. By thinking of all sentient beings as more precious than a wish-fulfilling jewel for accomplishing the highest aim, I will always hold them dear. So the way that this verse is written is more in accord with how Geshe Langri Tampa wrote the verses. I'll show you the Tibetan for those of you who read Tibetan. Can you see it? Okay. And so if you can't read it, don't worry, but I'll go through it for those who can. All right. You see my cursor down on the text? That's where the actual 8 verses start. Da ni means myself. Semchen means sentient beings. Tamche means all of us, all sentient beings. La, to them. Yishin Norbu Le Lakpe, means more precious than a wish granting jewel. So to think about this, who's better to us? Buddhas, bodhisattvas, spiritual guides? Who's more important to our enlightenment? That group or all sentient beings? What do you think? Anybody want to weigh in on that question? It's a debate question. Who's more important for our enlightenment? Meeting with a true teacher, a Buddha, an enlightened being who can guide us, or all sentient beings? Anybody want to try?
The triple gem.
Triple gem. Okay. And that's how we usually think. You know, it's
All
without,
sentient being.
okay, there's somebody weighing in on the other side, right? Really, they're both essential. We can't become enlightened without either one. If we didn't have the spiritual guides, we wouldn't know what was going on or where we were or where we came from or where we're going, right? And so we need that guidance in order to make progress. However, very often when practitioners are practicing, they start to disregard the importance of sentient beings. There was one story of a geshe who was teaching, and somebody at the back of the crowd hit a dog with a stick. And the geshe yelled out in pain. And he pulled up his robe, and there was a big bruise right where the dog had been hit. And he said, why did you do that? Right? If we honor the Buddhas and we offer to them, and then we're miserable to the beings around us, we miss the point, right? The Buddhas won't be pleased with our offering, right? Because really, what they've invested in, what they've put all their energy in, is trying to take care of all of us. The love that an enlightened being has for each of us is hundreds of thousands more strong than a mother has for her only child. And it is that love, it is that unconditional compassion that created the causes for them to become enlightened. If we cannot create that same kind of compassion and love, then we're not going to get there. It is dependent on sentient beings that we can become enlightened. Without sentient beings, there's no way. Because the whole purpose of enlightenment, the whole purpose of the path of the Bodhisattva is to become enlightened to help everyone. And so you need that love, you need that compassion. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it, all sentient beings, I mentioned we've been born again and again and again. Our mind can't stop. There's no way to destroy the subtle mind. And it's eventually, if we're lucky, we can purify it and become enlightened. But it has no beginning. It has no end. In all our previous lives, we had to have a mom, right? If we were born from a womb, we had a mom. In those previous lives as a human, somebody took care of us. Somebody had to protect us from danger. Somebody fed us. Somebody loved us. Somebody told us how to walk, how to talk, how to navigate the world. Without that, we wouldn't have survived. Think of your mother in this life, or whoever it was that raised you. Somebody had to protect you from yourself again and again every day, right? Or you wouldn't have made it, right? We have an incredible debt. Your mother or whoever cared for you in this life did that many times because there's no beginning to our lifetimes. We've all been each. Buddha said in scripture, he said, bhikkhus, he was talking to the monks, he said, inconceivable is this infinite stream of birth. I can see no being who hasn't been my mother, my father, my sister, my brother over this long, long time. That's reality, right? When we realize that all sentient beings have been our companions, and it is through their kindness that we've been able to have any happiness. If we've had any happiness, it's been through the kindness of others. Even now, we're using a computer. Where did this computer come from? How many people contributed, both directly and indirectly, to producing the technology that we are now using? The food that you eat, where did it come from? who developed it? Who transported it? Where, right? The roads that it was transported on, who built the roads? The trucks that transported the food, who made the, right? Anything we use is because of the current kindness of beings. So beings have been incredibly kind through all our previous lives when they were our moms. They continue to be incredibly kind with all the different things we're using to sustain ourselves, right? All the people we know who care for us, right? And in the future, our spiritual development completely depends on all sentient beings. So in this way, like you have oil tycoons who want to drill for black gold, right? Or you have miners of gold who want to get the yellow gold, or diamond miners who want to get diamonds. We all have a sense of treasure, In ancient India, the greatest treasure was this idea of the wish granting gem. That if you got a wish granting gem, you could just wish upon it, you could get anything you wanted. It's like Aladdin's lamp, right? Beings are like that. They're even infinitely more precious. If we had a gem that could give us whatever we want, we'd be set in this life. But each sentient being is like that. And so, therefore, the text goes on, Dunchok Drupe Sampayi, with an intention wanting to achieve the great goal, the great meaning, which is enlightenment. Daktu means continually, Chepa means cherish, Zimbarshol, may I hold them with an intense cherishing for each being. So that's the meaning of the verse. In the original, instead of shok at the end, Geshe Langritampa put Gil, I will do, right? But I will do. But later, a translator felt it's tough to, he softened it by saying, may I? He softened it. So very often it's translated as may I. So that's the opening verse. And it really gets to bodhicitta. Bodhicitta, if you have bodhicitta, the intention to become enlightened, to help all beings, you're a bodhisattva. What you do is within the great vehicle of Buddhism, Mahayana. If you don't have bodhicitta, if you at least try to develop an artificial bodhicitta, like now as we hear the teachings, right? And we kind of think about the contemplations, and for a while we get that wish to become enlightened to help all beings. That's good enough, right? That's a good start. What you have to do is keep generating it until it becomes natural. When it becomes natural and automatically you have that intention in the first verse, constantly seeing beings as dear, constantly not wanting to suffer, constantly wanting them to be happy, and constantly wanting to become enlightened so you know how to help them and you have the ability to help them more efficiently, then you're a true bodhisattva. When it becomes natural, you enter what's called the first path, the path of accumulation. There are 5 paths that a bodhisattva traverses. And when you have real bodhicitta, that's the entering gate. So it takes us to the second verse. Whenever I'm in the company of others, I will regard myself as the lowest among all. And from the depths of my heart, cherish others as supreme. This is probably the hardest verse for Westerners to swallow. I have a good friend who's an incredible Dharma practitioner, but hesitates to even recite these verses because I think younger probably got picked on because so charitable, such a charitable heart, right? And we know in this culture it's like that. If you don't assert yourself, people just walk all over you, right? And so we're taught from a very young age, you're the best, you're really good, nobody's better than you, I have to be number one, right? And so when we hear this verse, it's like cutting the knees out of that whole logic. The interesting thing in terms of research is that everybody knows about the self-esteem movement, right? It was big for the past 30 years. Self-esteem, you need to have good self-esteem, right? However, what researchers started to find, like Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer and other researchers, found that self-esteem has liabilities. The more somebody is promoting self-esteem, the more tendency towards narcissism, right? It's also brittle. If you think, hey, I'm the best, right? You're always going to meet somebody who's better than you in something. And what happens when people just they try to get that sense of confidence out of self-esteem model. Every time they meet somebody better, they feel insecure and shattered, right?
Well, in that case, if you meet someone better than yourself, shouldn't you ask them to learn from them?
Well, that's a better way to handle it. Yeah, right. But what Germer and Chris and F found out is that much more resilient than self-esteem is self-compassion. And it has the same benefits, but it doesn't have the liabilities. Self-compassion is more of the thought, and it would go along with what you said. You meet somebody who's better, more skilled than you in something, you say, oh, what could I learn from this person, right? That would be easier to do if you were using a self-compassion model for feeling okay about yourself. Because self-esteem, I'll pick on the last president because it was so clear, when every time I'm the greatest, nobody's greater than me, nobody's better than me, right? That's the self-esteem model, and it's unrealistic. Because of course there are people smarter than Trump. Of course there are people more skilled than him in lots of things, right? And it's an unrealistic expectation to try to feel good by promoting yourself as the best because it's just not true. It's not based on reality. Whereas self-compassion is true. And the difference in the self-talk with self-compassion is, hey, I'm human. I have my strengths. I have my weaknesses. I'm neither better nor worse than any human, right? We're all struggling to survive on this planet, going through all sorts of hardships as we try to thrive. And just like I think all others are really valuable and important, I have to extend that same thought to myself. Even though I'm flawed, even though I'm not perfect, I'm trying my best. And I could afford to have compassion for myself and support for myself, just like I would extend to anybody else. And what Germer and Neff found is people take a self-compassion model. It does cause them to feel okay about themselves. Also, they have better health outcomes. They have better luck in relationships. those are just, they have lots of benefits, right, that have been found empirically from the self-compassion model. So anyway, I just want to put that out there because I always love it when I see these Western empiricism kind of dovetailing with the findings in Buddhism. But let's go back into the verse. Let's use a self-compassion model for understanding this verse. This verse is not suggesting what I found in the coffee cup my mother gave me, right? It's not suggesting you put a target on yourself, right? What it is suggesting is that when you see a being, to try to cherish them, to try to see them as something very precious, something very valuable. And for a little while, to let yourself not be the center stage. That being that you're perceiving, let that being be the center stage, right? And see the importance of them. Generally, there are three levels that we have. One level is when we see somebody who's better than us in something. If we're holding to the self-esteem model of trying to feel good about ourselves, we get jealous. If we see somebody at the same level as us, we get competitive. If we see someone lower than us, we get disdain and pride. Oh, they're nothing compared to me. The little people, right? Kind of thing, right? That's how egotism and self-esteem work. So this is trying to crush that process. Instead of having those three levels, right? By seeing all beings as supreme, we're always honoring who we meet. I'm going to ask you this. Are you absolutely certain that you have not in your life met a Buddha? And if so, how do you know? How do you know who is? How do you know who isn't? Right? An enlightened being isn't going to tout themselves, right? When I first met with Buddhism, I think about this all the time. I was in University of California at Santa Cruz, and I was in a course, literally the first day of the course, and the instructor was saying, "Is the theater really dead?" Which, I don't know if you know the Simon and Garfunkel song where it makes fun of that concern, is the theater really dead? And I couldn't believe I had to take this course for my major. I was studying aesthetic studies and music. And I came out of the course like dreading it. And this friend, I don't even know where this friend came from. He just suddenly started hanging around me in college. He was kind of low-keyed kind of guy and just friendly, right? And he was in the course with me, and we came out, we're walking. He looked at his watch. He said, "Hey, we still got time to go see that Lama teaching over in Oaks College." I said, "What?" He said, "There's a Tibetan Lama. He's teaching there." And I said, "Really?" And so we went running across campus. And when we got to the hall where the Lama was speaking, it was packed. It was a big hall. There were people everywhere. It was Lama Yeshe. There was Lama Yeshe, this jolly Tibetan monk, laughing and teaching, right? And I realized I had finally arrived. I've been looking for this my whole life, and I didn't realize it until I was there. As soon as I got connected with Lama Yeshe, that friend disappeared from my life. It's not that we had a fight or anything. It's just dynamics changed, and to this day, I wonder, who was that guy? How do I know he wasn't like some enlightened being trying to get me back on the path, right? So that's my challenge to you. Who in your life is like that? Who in your life has absolutely been by your side and helped you in ways that you're in their debt to this day. That's one of those people for me, right? Um, so when you have that attitude of always cherishing others, it's like there's a saying in Tibet that the water of knowledge will not stay on the mountain peak of pride, right? It always goes down into the valleys. And so this verse is like being like the ocean. Where all the water goes is the lowest point in the world, and that's the oceans. And if you take that stance of the ocean, like you're on the lowest, everybody else is supreme, you're always learning from whoever you meet. Everybody becomes like a guide and precious. And it's a profoundly beautiful place to be. So that's the second verse. I'll read the Tibetan to you so you see the Tibetan. Dagni means myself. Kunne means always. Men means lowest. Ta means see. I will always see myself as lowest. Xing means and. Shenla to others. Sampa, I will think. Dakpa continually. Dapa yi. Choktu chepa, I will cherish them as supreme. Chok means supreme. Zimbar shok, I will hold them that way. So that's our challenge. All right, so this is the second verse of those 4 verses about cherishing others and seeing the good qualities in others. By the way, I forgot to tell you the line that Geshe Longri Tongpa gave for this second verse is, in particular, view yourself as lowly and cultivate respect for others. That was the line that he gave with this one. Which brings us to the third verse. The line he wrote for this verse is, watch your mind and drive out mental afflictions. So here's the third verse. In my every action, I will watch my mind. And the moment destructive emotions arise, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they hurt both me and others. So that part of our mind that still thinks that we're the best, right? And that still cherishes just ourself. It's there from the time we wake up in the morning, and it's there through the day, and it's there as we go to sleep. How many of you get grumpy if somebody wakes you up from a deep sleep? I know I do, right? And you can see it. That's basically the clinging, that clinging to comfort of the comfort of sleep, right? There are different causes of anger. One is when we're deprived of something we want. I call that a thwarted goal, when something gets in between us and what we want. Another reason we get angry is if somebody insults us, we feel a hurt to our pride, and that makes us angry. Another thing that can defeat us is when we see injustice, which is a bit higher level of frustration, right? That's shows some compassion and concern, right? But whatever it is, as we're going through the day, we have to keep 2 things in mind. In Tibetan, they're called Drempa and Sheishin. Drempa means recollection. In this case, recollecting this path that we're on and all that goes into it. Sheishin means vigilance. Vigilance in trying to watch how we're reacting to our day. As soon as an affliction comes, we have to be aware of it if we want to make progress on the path. lots of teachings here. In Tibet, they used to have roaming dogs in the street. They called them thief dogs. If you left your door open and you had some food out on the table and you turned your back, the dog would sneak in and grab the food and be gone before you knew it, right? And so they used to keep a stick near the door. You know, if a thief dog came in, they'd whack it and try to get it out of the house. And the teaching is that we should treat our selfish mind like a thief dog. That every time we see it come in, it's going to steal away our virtues. It's going to steal away our path, right? And we have to be vigilant. We have to stop it in its tracks. Usually in the world, we have outer enemies and we have inner enemies. Outer enemies are people who resent us, who don't like us, who get in the way, who take things from us, right? Might even kill us. Inner enemies are much worse. They're different things, right? If you're nice to an external enemy, there's a chance that they might eventually become your friend. Have you in your life had somebody who you couldn't stand who later becomes a close friend? I have. I'm sure we've had friends who became enemies, right? It's changeable. And how you treat them can change how they treat you very often. I'm not saying always, sometimes somebody is so mean that no matter what you do, they're going to keep trying to hurt you, right? However, inner enemies are quite different. If you treat your inner enemies well, no matter how well you treat them, they will only hurt you worse. Like, think about it. If you, let's say, have a little bit of laziness, you like to sleep in. If you indulge that, after a while, it becomes a habit, doesn't it? If you have a vice, let's say you like occasionally nipping on some schnapps or something, I don't know, a beer or something like that. If you continue to cultivate that friendship with beer, does it get better or does it become a problem? It becomes a problem, right? Same with any internal obstacle. The more you're friendly to it, the more it will overtake you and the more it will consume you until it really hurts you in a big way. Think of selfishness. Your worst enemy, external enemy. What's the worst they can do to you? They could torture and kill you, right? Which is horrible, but that's only one life. This internal enemy of the selfish mind, how many times has it thrown us into terrible realms of existence? Infinite times. Right? It's hurt us again and again and again. It's much more hideous to us than any external enemy. And so if we realize that, and again, external enemies you can change. The internal enemies of the afflictions, no matter how much you're nice to them, they'll just get worse. Let's go back to external enemies. If you defeat somebody at work who's been challenging you, for a little bit, you've got victory, right? But then later, let's say they're nurturing a grudge, can't they come and give you havoc later, right? Internal enemies aren't like that. If you defeat an internal enemy, it can't come back. You can defeat an internal enemy so that it's gone completely. That's called a true cessation. which is the goal of the path in Buddhism, to have a complete elimination of those afflictions from their roots, and they can't get back up and hurt you again. So this verse is very important. With external enemies, we can be kind. We can do all the Bodhisattva activities. With the internal enemies of the afflictions, no mercy. There's a difference there. Mercy with beings makes sense because they have feelings and they, right? And we want to make sure not to cause them pain. The afflictions, if you destroy them, you're not hurting anybody. You're helping yourself, right? You're being kind to yourself. There's a concept in Western psychology. It's called ego dystonic versus ego syntonic. And what it means when something's ego syntonic, it means we feel okay about a quality of ourselves. Like, let's say you're a tea drinker and you like tea and you feel okay about it. That's ego syntonic. Ego dystonic is when something we do we don't feel so good about. We feel some shame about it. We wish we didn't have that habit. So let's say you're a drinker of beer and you wish you weren't. That's ego dystonic. It's still a habit, but you wish it weren't, right? So what we have to do with narcissism, if you look at the former president, his narcissism seemed to be ego syntonic. Yes, I'm the best. What's wrong with you? Why can't you see I'm the best? If you don't see I'm the best, I'll kill you. I'll make sure I'll get in your way. I'll do bad things to you and your family, right? Because I'm the best, right? So that's very ego syntonic narcissism. Ego dystonic narcissism is being referred to in this verse. To see those destructive emotions as enemies and immediately, as soon as they arise, face them and try to eliminate them. When our narcissism becomes ego dystonic, it's not like putting ourselves down because the narcissism just hurts us. It's like an inner poison. And so it's actually protective of us to get rid of it. So when you face down those inner enemies, you're being friendly to yourself. And that's the crucial point. Those inner enemies don't even stop by hurting us. They they hurt everybody around us. And so I'll do the Tibetan for that verse. Okay. Let's see where we're. Okay, here it is. The second pecha. Chulam means through all our daily activities. Kuntu in all of them. Rongyu means my mind. La means to my mind. Tokjing Yungmo. Tok are errant concepts that come up in the mind, like seeing self-existent nature in ourselves and in external things. Nyumong are mental afflictions that come from that wrong view about reality. Gematak means as soon as they rise, it's easier to stop them when they're small before they become habitual. Dak Chen means myself and others. Marung means wrong. They're hurtful to myself and others. Jepe means they create bad things for myself and others. Na. Sentab means forcefully. Dong means face. Ne means then. Dokbar means turn them back. Shok means may I. I face them and turn them back. I was watching for my class that I'm teaching on forensic social work, I watched a video about juvenile sex offenders, and one of the treatments that they use for them is to get them to admit all of the times they've offended. And they even use a lie detector test, to try to get them to be honest about their past offenses. And the thought is, until people can admit what they've done wrong, they're going to continue to hide it, and they're going to continue to do it. And it's only when they can confess and come clean that you can get honest traction in terms of change. I would say the same with our internal afflictions. Until we can be honest with ourselves, until we can see the negativity in our own mind and how it affects our actions, we're not going to change it. And so the first step is to face it and to see it. And then the second stage is to disenable it.
But say it's really gross, and then you get kind of like, oh yuck, I'm like that, how horrible. Then how do you not get sad that you're, that
I couldn't quite make out what you said. Would you try to?
Yeah, sorry. It's just if you realize that you do this thing that's really actually pretty gross,
Mhm.
then you take it, you're like, oh, yuck, I'm so horrible. Like, how do you stop going down that path once you've admitted something that about you don't like?
That's a great question. In fact, the video I was watching about the sex offenders was similar. Like that was the next thing they had to deal with once they got them to admit their offenses and what they had done to other people. They had that second stage of, oh, I'm a horrible, worthless human being, right? That too is an affliction of mine. It's dumping on ourselves and not seeing our own Buddha nature and our own potential. And so that too becomes something we have to remedy, right? Really, the horrible thing isn't us, it's the afflictions. The afflictions aren't inherent to our nature. When you get into Buddha nature, the consciousness itself is neither good nor bad. It's neutral. It's just awareness. When it associates with afflictions, it becomes colored by them and it becomes negative. That same consciousness, though, can associate with love, it can associate with wisdom, it can associate with compassion, and then it becomes quite beautiful, right? Similarly, when you say myself, what is myself? And this is leaping ahead to absolute bodhicitta, right? But what is myself? Isn't it really a projection? When we say me, isn't that really a mental imputation? And so, because I've done horrible things, does that mean I am horrible? No, it does not. That is not a logical conclusion. What it means is we become habituated to a certain pattern of afflictions and behaviors, but that can change. Our innate Buddha nature is not sullied by it. Our innate Buddha nature can be purified of it. All we have to do is apply the antidotes and follow the path, and we can purify it. And so that can lift us out of despondency or self-deprecation when we have a pattern that's hard for us to change. All Buddhas were like us at some point. They all had the same like hideous patterns they couldn't stand about themselves, right? All that kind of stuff. It's just a matter of persevering and continuing to try to cleanse that part of ourselves. And it can be done because our inherent nature is pure. We lack self-nature. That lack of self-nature is the same as what the Buddhas have. They lack self-nature at that level of their mind. That clear light of nature of the mind is like water. water can be polluted, but then it can be distilled and purified. Same with our mind. And so I think it's good to remember that. Remember your Buddha nature so that you can lift yourself out of that defeated feeling of shame, right?
Thank you.
Sure. Which brings us actually to the next verse, because the next verse is very much pointed at that. The line for the next verse that Geshe Langri Tampa wrote is, cherish is hard to find those who in their misery commit evil or suffer greatly. Because just like we have patterns that we feel ashamed of and that we feel terrible about, the same is true of all enlightened beings, right? It's actually a lower level when they don't feel ashamed of it, right? If we get the level where we're ashamed of it, we're making progress on the path, right? We're actually getting somewhere on our path. So this fourth verse, whenever I see ill-natured beings or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds or suffering, I will cherish them as something rare, as though I'd found a priceless treasure. This also occurred to me as I was watching the video about sex offenders. These are kids, right? Some of them teens. And as they're confessing in front of the camera their misdeeds, and they're talking about how horrible they feel about themselves, and they're talking about their past of being victims of abuse themselves, what really struck me is that each of them, I could see my mind turn, because very often when you hear about somebody who's a predator, I mean, we think scum of the earth, right? Horrible, get rid of them, right? You'll hear people say, kill them, right? But when you actually watch these kids tell their story, instead of feeling like they're someone terrible, the mind turns and you can see them as actually very precious. Yeah, they've had a really terrible experience early in their life. They've done terrible things that have hurt people, and they're owning up to it, and they're feeling remorse, they're feeling horror. But you can see there's Buddha nature there, there's preciousness there. And that ability, like even Trump, even though I feel like he contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and did terrible things, I think, with his power, I still see him as very precious, right? And he has that Buddha nature, just we all do, right? And the people who raided the Capitol building, for instance, each one of them has Buddha nature. A lot of them were misguided. They had been told this kooky QAnon stuff, and they really believed it, right? And just like that, we're all deluded by wrong views. We all are. We all have the misconception that we have a self nature, right? We all have afflictions of mind. And similarly to that example, it leads us into negative behaviors that hurt other people, sometimes in terrible ways. The art of the bodhisattva is to see all that, and instead of that becoming a cause of rejecting beings and not caring about them, turn it into a cause for more deep cherishing, because those are the beings who really need our help. Those are the beings who truly are causing suffering, not just to themselves, but to people around them. And that's the whole path of the bodhisattva, isn't it? To reach out to those suffering beings and to liberate them. And so for a bodhisattva, instead of avoiding beings like that, it's like seeing that as an incredibly precious opportunity. Like, finally, I found what I've been looking for. maybe this is a being I can help or try to help. At the very least, it's a chance for me to try to see the beauty and the value there underneath all those levels of hurt and um, um, torment. There's this potential in this being. And so that's the call. That's the call. As you can see, this is not easy stuff. These practices are not easy. The Tibetan for this one, Rongxin means nature. Nyapa means bad nature. Semchen Ni, sentient beings whose nature seems evil or bad or twisted in some way. Dik means doing bad deeds. Duk means experiencing suffering, intense suffering. So for instance, when we see a homeless person by the edge of the street and we have to walk by them, who here does not get an uneasy feeling? Right? Like, well, they're going to ask me for something, or maybe they'll do something weird. I don't know, right? For the bodhisattva, there's an attempt for a true bodhisattva would not see it that way. They would see it like an incredible opportunity, like something very precious, right? But for us, it becomes a challenge. You know, how can I turn myself from that original repulsion and fear and get back to my bodhicitta and see this as a human being and see this as somebody suffering and somebody who needs help, right? Drakpo means fierce suffering or fierce bad deeds. Nun means oppressed by them. Tong Se means when I see that, when I see somebody like that. Rinchen Ter means like a jewel treasure. Trepashin, I will hold them that way. Nyepakawe means extremely difficult to find. Chok, I will hold them and cherish them as something very difficult, someone very difficult to find. All right, so these 4 verses, as I said, hit that third point of cherishing others and the good qualities that come from cherishing others, which leads us to the 5th verse. The line that Geshe Langri Tampa wrote for the 5th verse is, accept such loss as being blamed without trying to defend yourself. These practices get increasingly harder, right? And so this one is a step up, and it takes us into that 4th point of exchanging self for others, the actual mind of Dakshin Yamje, of exchanging, holding ourselves as the center of the universe, and instead see others as the center of our universe, right? Exchanging self for others doesn't mean I become you, you become me. It means that up to now, all my past lives, I've always thought myself as the center of the universe, the most important one. That has brought me nothing but suffering. That viewpoint has brought me again and again into misery. Whereas I see bodhisattvas and Buddhas who are completely happy, and they've put others first. Others are the most precious, right? If I want to become like them, I've got to do the same thing. And so I'm going to take the step of, instead of seeing me first, I'm going to flip that and see you first. Right? That's the true exchange. If we can do that, instead of me, it's you. If you can do that, you're ready to try these next 2 verses, right? Which we're I can
Okay.
hear a question coming.
Yeah, sorry. Like,
Yes,
say you're alone. Like, it's one thing. I mean, not can I can do that. I can't do this with other when people are around. But if you're alone, how do you like? It's one thing if someone's in front of you, you have someone to exchange with. But when you're by yourself, who do you exchange with?
Oh, okay. I understand your question. When you're by yourself, who can you practice with? If you're like me, when you're by yourself, you have all sorts of thoughts of other people all the time. Each of those thoughts of people can become the focal point, right? Where instead of seeing yourself as what can I get from them, you can work with your thoughts and your feelings to try to change it towards what can I do for that person? What do they need? How can I start to feel love for them and compassion for them? And so you can work with your thoughts. Okay. So inevitably, though, like in this case, we do meet directly, even if it's through cyberspace, right? If you work, there are lots of opportunities to practice this verse because it'll happen all the time. Whenever someone out of envy does me wrong by attacking or belittling me, I will take defeat upon myself and give the victory to others. That's so powerful. You know, how many times has somebody um, um, tried to humiliate you or put you down in front of other people? You know that feeling. It's like, you know, how dare them, right? It brings up your fighting spirit. The practice here is just let it happen. Because from a karmic point of view, that gives us the opportunity to purify a really negative karma, right? And also we can see our egotism well up when we want the revenge. We take the bait and we get angry and we want to retaliate. If instead of retaliation we can cool and try to look inward at the inner enemy instead of the outer enemy and try to work with that and neutralize it so that we can suck it in, that's a huge victory for a bodhisattva. It's not a defeat, right?
Question?
Yeah.
I have a question. What if there are others involved? What if you're speaking of a mother, for example, trying to protect her children from an abuser? Or if within your acquaintance, you're on the side of the underdogs against someone else?
In that case, it's a little different. What I would do mentally, I would still suggest this practice of accepting the defeat, right? And giving them a victory. However, out of compassion for the other people involved, I would use the compassion to take a stand, right? Because that's the right thing to do for the sake of the kids, the sake of others, to go ahead and take a stand. But again, it's a totally different motivation for doing that. It's not defending self, it's really out of defending the well being of the people around you. Does that make sense? In fact, I think you'll be more effective if you use compassion to set the limits than if you're going out of reactive anger. I actually think you'll be much more effective at establishing boundaries and being successful in what you want to do. Because anger clouds our judgment. We tend to, when we get angry, we tend to lose. One psychologist, Ross Green, said we lose 60 IQ points when we get mad, right? Whereas if we get our composure back and we're thinking with compassion, compassion doesn't cloud our judgment. And when we're working from compassion, we can see more clearly the motives and what's driving somebody to do us harm. And that empathy and compassion makes us more skillful in knowing what we need to do to get them to stop and to do it in a way that protects people around us too. So I would still use this verse, but I would add that other layer to it. So if that makes sense. Which kind of, I'll do the Tibetan, and that question is gonna take us into the next verse quite nicely. So here we are. Okay, Dala towards myself. Shengi Trakoki means somebody who's jealous of me, by them. She means harm. Kur means disrespect. La so forth. Midrikbe, very unsuitable, very unfair. Yonka Rangi Lembadang, I'll accept the defeat. Gyalka Shenla Buorshok, I'll give them the victory. Right? So in a way, this is just disengaging from that tit for tat, back and forth revenge cycle. It's just disengaging. However, to protect others, again, out of compassion, to come back and set the limits that you need to set. But I usually find it's helpful for me to take a day or two to cool out when something like that happens until I can get my composure back and my compassion back. And then I'm usually much more effective when I go forward into it. Which brings us to the 6th verse. And this is probably the hardest practice of them all. Geshe Langri Tangpa says, recognize one who harms you as more kind than one who helps you. It's a tough practice. So even when someone I have helped or whom I have placed great hopes mistreats me very unjustly, I will view that person as a true spiritual teacher. So this is really hard to do, but there are lots of opportunities for it. In his commentary, Sarme Khensa Rinpoche gives the example of, let's say somebody's been a friend of your family for generations. Your grandfather helped this person's grandfather. Your father helped this person's father. You were childhood friends. You're very close. And your friend rises into a position where they're very powerful, right? And you want, let's say, a job that they can get you access to. And so you go to them and you say, hey, good to see you again. Hey, there's this job opening over here. Could you write me a letter of recommendation or help me with it? And so that's the setup. What the person then does is thinks, oh, I didn't know that job was there. They think silent to themselves. That'd be really good for my son to have that job. And so they take the information you gave them and they give the information to their son and get the job for their son and brush you aside, right? Stuff like that happens all the time. Somebody you thought would help you, but instead they do something really mean, right? Very often, what's the reaction? It is total rage. I thought they were my friend, right? You're supposed to be my friend, right? That's the typical reaction. Again, if you look at where does it come from, it's our self-cherishing, which is ultimately at the bottom of those reactions. The reason to see the person as a spiritual guide is they just pointed out your self-cherishing to you. When you get that rage reaction, it's like they're teaching you, hey, you're not there yet. You're not totally doing the bodhisattva thing yet. You got that pocket of self-cherishing. Look at it, right? And if you can see it that way, right on the moment, it really helps you chill out. And let go. I had this happen. My grandmother was a millionaire. She had this huge estate in Santa Fe she owned a whole mountain, 2 or 3 mountains in Santa Fe, beautiful land. And all of her grandkids were in her will to inherit this land. When she died, my uncle and my father got together, and it was mostly driven by an uncle who said, let's develop this land and it'll make a fortune for the grandkids and we'll all be rich. And so they had us all sign off on this contract, and we were going to all be rich. And then the market went bad and it started losing money. My father had a problem where he had to be in a halo to keep his neck intact because he had a tumor in his spine, had to be removed, and he was out of commission. My uncle started borrowing money out of my father's bank account to try to stave off this deficit. And when my father found out that all this money, he was hemorrhaging all this money while he was sick, he had to call the bank and say, stop giving money to this uncle, right? The uncle was kind of a greedy guy. And what happened is my uncle emerged with all the land. Grandkids got nothing. And then my uncle wrote a letter to all the family vilifying my father. And so my father put out a note kind of defending himself a little bit, but that was kind of it. And so I was visiting one of my Tibetan teachers, Lobsang Lungpa, who lived in Santa Fe with his wife, Gigi. And I made a plan to go see my uncle, who is now living in the stolen land in a big mansion. It was the hardest thing I ever did in my life, but I thought of this verse, to try to see him as a spiritual teacher instead of, somebody I hated, right? And it was very good for me spiritually to try to do that. So I think we all have people like that in our lives. If you can do this successfully, it means one really bad karma finished for you. You've taken a really harmful situation and you've turned it into the path. And so it's like a huge victory as a bodhisattva to be able to do that. I'll read the Tibetan to you. So let me find it. Okay, here. Rewa Chewa. Oh, no, starts here. I'm sorry. Kangla to someone, Dagi by me, Pendakbe, who I have benefited, Rewa Chewa Kanshiki, to whom I have great hope that they're going to help me, right? Shintu Mirik, who does a terribly inappropriate thing, right? Nujenang, who harms me instead of helping me. Shenyan Dampa, a holy spiritual guide. Tawarshok, may I see them that way. So that's the meaning of the verse. So if you've managed to get through these 6 verses and you integrate them, then you've reached that 4th point for training the mind, exchanging self for others, the actual exchange of self for others. Which brings us to the 5th point of the teachings for exchanging self for others, which is Tonglen, giving and taking. And that practice of giving and taking is described in the next verse. The line that Geshe Langri Tokpa gave for this one is, give help and happiness to others and take on their harm and their suffering. Easier said than done, but this is a great practice because once you know it, you can do it all the time. Even with your breath, you can do it as you breathe. And great lamas practice it all the time. In brief, directly or indirectly, I will offer help and happiness to all my mothers. Again, all beings through countless lifetimes have been our moms. And seeing them that way brings kind of a sense of cherishing them into our hearts. And secretly take upon myself all their hurt and suffering. So secretly usually means kind of a hidden practice, which this does mean. It does mean you don't boast about it. Hey, I'm taking on your suffering and I'm giving you well-being, right? You don't make a big to do about it. It's very kind of on the down low that you're practicing giving and taking, right? But here, really, the meaning of secretly means that it's hard. This is a hard practice to do. Most of us, when we practice it, we feel a little scared because we don't want suffering, right? We want just happiness. However, if you get really clear that really the cause of our suffering isn't the external sufferings in the world so much, it's that mind that just cherishes ourself. That's been the cause of our past suffering. It's the cause of our current suffering. It's going to be the cause of our future suffering. And when you see that clearly, it doesn't become so scary to practice this. Because when you imagine taking on the suffering that you see in others, that's who you feed it to. You imagine feeding the suffering to that self-cherishing mind and say, here, eat this. Right? You who just cherish yourself, what's it like to be going through that, right? That you see others go through. And that starts to weaken the self-cherishing mind, which liberates you. And when you realize that it's good for you to practice this, it doesn't become so scary. It becomes kind of reassuring. There are lots of ways to visualize this practice. One way, usually the giving and taking practice starts, even though it says giving and taking, giving is done with kindness, taking away suffering is done with compassion. In actual practice, it starts with taking. And I'll say this to you, if I offer you some ice cream, but you have a toothache, are you going to want my ice cream? Oh, because the toothache is too painful. You know, you don't even think about ice cream when you have a toothache, right? So the taking away of the suffering is done first, because then when you do give what a being needs, they can enjoy it because they're no longer tormented by the suffering. So this can be done visually and it can be done with your breath. One way I heard recently, you may interpret taught this way of visualizing it, is when you breathe out, imagine all of your virtue takes the form of light going out through your right nostril and in through the left nostril of all sentient beings, filling them with light and well-being and giving them whatever they want. And then out of their right nostril comes all of their suffering in the form of black light. And you inhale that through your left nostril, feed it to your self-cherishing mind until it disappears. And then imagine all your well-being and virtue again well up as light out through the right nostril. And you do that like a cycle, out with the good and with the bad, right? If you will. That's one way. There are lots of ways to visualize this. In terms of what you give, you can give physical well-being. You can imagine wealth. You can imagine food, shelter. You can imagine internal well-being, love, compassion, everything that a being needs. You can imagine healing of the sick, taking away their illness. So you can use your imagination to the extent you like. And this is why you don't need somebody right in front of you. You can do it just with your imagination as you're practicing. So I'll read you the Tibetan. And again, this can become automatic if you get used to it. Dorna means in brief. Ngua means directly. Donggyupa means indirectly. So directly, if you see a beggar, you can give them some money if you like, if you want to practice giving directly. Or if you're in the health profession, you can try to take away somebody's sickness directly. Indirectly is using your imagination to do the practice. Ben means benefit. De means happiness and well-being. Ma means mothers. Nam kun means all of them, all mother sentient beings. La bul means I give. Maye ne means my mother sentient beings harms. Dong dungel means suffering. Kun all of it. Sangwei means secretly. Dagla to myself. Lembar shok I will accept, I will take in. And so that's the practice of a bodhisattva. The last verse brings us to ultimate bodhicitta. Up until now, everything we've been talking about is called relative bodhicitta, which is relating to beings in the relative world of myself and you, right? This and that. While we're doing these practices, we can at the same time cultivate ultimate bodhicitta, which is seeing correctly how things are. The mistaken notion, there are two main internal enemies. I mentioned self-cherishing, that's one. And we've been trying to take out self-cherishing with the first 7 verses, how to reduce it. The remaining big boogeyman of the mind is dangzin, which means self-grasping. When we hold to ourself as if we exist from our own side. That mistaken notion about how we exist is the root for desire, anger, jealousy, pride, all the related afflictions of mind come out of that mistaken grasping at a self. So this last verse is pointed at that to try to get rid of the dangzin, the self-grasping. I will learn to keep all these practices untainted by thoughts of the 8 worldly concerns, which are I want fame, gain, praise, pleasure. I don't want to lose what I have. I don't want people to blame me or criticize me. I don't want to be a nobody. I don't want pain. Those 8 worldly concerns drive most human behavior. If you do Dharma practice with those 8 concerns in mind, it becomes tainted. It doesn't become real Dharma practice. Like if you think, oh, look at me, I'm such a good person, everybody should admire that I'm a bodhisattva. Right there, you ruin it. Right? And so this stuff is supposed to be done at heart level, sincerely, without concern about gain and loss. It should really be done out of truly cherishing others and really caring about trying to help them in the most effective way you can. So try to get free of those. The next 2 lines, may I recognize all things as like illusions and without attachment gain freedom from bondage. This dangzin, self-grasping, has been at the hub of our cyclic existence from beginningless time. When we can finally dispel it, the afflictions have nowhere to hold. Our mind becomes peaceful, liberated. It can become completely purified. And that's how we can awaken into full enlightenment. So how are things like an illusion? The 3 typical examples are a moon reflected in the water. It looks like there's a moon really there, but if you grasp, you can't get it, right? You just get your hand wet, right? Yet still, when you stop grasping at the moon, there's that moon reflected in the water. Similarly, we have a sense of me, and it's based on our aggregates, our form aggregate, our body, and all that goes into the body, our mind, including feelings of pleasure and pain and indifference, our conceptions about things and categorizing and distinguishing between things, all the impulses in our mind, good and bad, all the emotions that we have, our cognition of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, mental cognition, that mental awareness. Those are the ingredients. But if you look among them, you can't find any really independent me. And yet we still conceive of this me all the time, like that reflection of the moon in the lake. That sense of me is just always there. It's like an illusion, right? It's always hovering there. But if we can see it for what it is that it doesn't really exist from its own side. This is a mental construct. Then it lessens our grasping at it. It becomes more like a cloud, or not something that we have to work so hard to try to preserve, right? We can let go. We don't have to defend it. It's an illusion. Similarly, the things it clings to, the sense of mine, like our aggregates, those too are illusory. Like they're like foam. They're constantly changing. They're not constant. They depend on lots of different things. Because we're interdependent, so are the things around us. And when you have that kind of sense of it, it's like a magician. They can use different things to try to make an illusion of a horse or I don't know if you've ever seen this. They put up a sheet and there's a light behind the sheet, and then they use shadows. You think there's a horse behind there, but there's really not. The magician can see that it's an illusion, but the audience gets fooled. They think, oh, there's really a horse there. Right? Similarly, on a dark night, if you see a coiled rope, you might think it's a snake. But if you got your flashlight and you put the flashlight on it, you see, no, it's not a snake. It's a rope. As soon as that happens, your fear disappears. Similarly, when you can see through the illusion of self and see that it has no self nature, your apprehension, your clinging, your desire, your craving, all of it gets wiped out. And you become free. And so bodhisattvas constantly dwell in that perfection of wisdom. That's their home. They constantly live there while they practice all of these other practices. So the line that Geshe Longri Tangpa wrote for this last verse is remain pure and overcome attachments to illusory objects. Those are the 8 verses. You got them. Any questions or? Oh, I'll tell you a practice you can do. While you recite these 8 verses, you can imagine your spiritual guide as Amitabha Buddha sitting on top of your head. And every time you say a verse, you can imagine light descends from Amitabha, filling your whole body with light and dispelling any obstacles to realizing the verse and imbuing you with bodhicitta and wisdom. And you can do that visualization with each verse as you recite it. So that's 8 verses. Very complete, very wonderful Dharma. Okay, we're almost at noon. We have time for a question if anybody has one.
I'll ask one if I can.
Okay.
In
I'm having a
my
hard
younger-
time. I'm having a hard time discerning what you're saying. But
Is it any better now?
I can hear a little better.
I wanted to say that in my younger days, I used to think in the terms of modernist uh, thesis and rationality. And every practice uh, understands some kind of an internal fight and puts accent on it that is more important than marking your external challenges, enemies, or so on. However, what I found difficult is in the long term to objectively mark my internal enemies. Some things I would overlook and I would, throw out of the window, carriage with a baby, thinking that I don't really need that. And in the short term, I would have initial success that, of course, I would be proud of in these days. But later on, it seems that it would take away from my endurance. Like a good rest is a part of, good training, and sometimes I would underestimate what components do I need in order to make my undertaking have a deeper root and be durable in the challenges that were coming on later. So sometimes I would say I would take maybe a rigidly ascetic approach to it and say I don't really need to do that. Why my ratio, my tiny scope of awareness does not see this component as needed, and I would throw it out of the window. But later on, it felt like it would rebound to me in the terms of hindrances to my motivation. So then I realized, hey, I still need that. That I overlooked. It seems to be an important component for this and that reason. And that wouldn't be the problem. If until this day I can say I cannot identify all the valuable ingredients, And again, that will be the end of the trouble. But if I would be able to identify like 90% of that, but I'm not sure that I can. It seems that by using our ratio to identify what is useful and not from the bed of nature, uh, I wasn't able to do that. So it's basically I have this flux going back, opening and narrowing my scope all the time, similar to the breath of trying to take a better route and incorporate some of the things that I have disregarded, and then again outcasting them or some others in my practice. And so I know this sounds a very wide question, but I don't know if you guys know what I meant to say.
Okay, if I couldn't hear it.
Everything because the audio wasn't good. But what I was getting a sense of is that when you have a problem, you try to think of what's causing it, and there can be lots of different thoughts about it, and it can be unclear to see all the factors that contribute to it. Um, and if I was understanding that part correctly, then I would say yes. I think that's the truth that we all go through as we try this path. Um, the Buddha said that the most complicated topic is karma. And then until we're completely enlightened, we're not going to see all its different facets and how intricate it is and how all of its workings. And so I think we always have that sense of uncertainty on the path about what's contributing to what and what the current actions are going to do for the future, right? And so it's a little bit unclear. But at the same time, I think Dharma teachings can really be a good beacon and can help us narrow in on what to do. Like, for example, if I'm trying to respond to a difficult situation by getting angry and trying to do something retaliatory, I'm probably not making a good choice, right? And so I need to cool out, get back my compassion, and then try again, right? And so I think why we can't see all the details of what to do and what not to do, the Dharma provides a roadmap that's very useful in it. By the way, I also saw in chat, Dan Lowe wrote to everybody Danilo. What I recommend to do in an abusive situation is to support the person being abused and help them leave the relationship. Yes, I would agree. However, don't spread hate towards the abusive party. Yes. Don't let anger breed. That will only lower yourself to their level and may cause you to behave in heedless manner. True. I recommend Brahma Vihara meditation towards both parties and let justice handle the other person rather than attempting to punish them yourself. Right, that sounds like good advice. I'm I'm going to stop here, but I have to say it's been a real privilege being part of this, and I wish I could meet all of you directly. Some of you I know for years, and some of you I'm just getting to know. And I hope that once it's safe to do so, maybe we can all meet again at the NKL or some other Dharma event. And so it's been wonderful.
Wilson,
Yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Mhm.
I was just wondering, I mean, this was a very nutrient dense talk. Thank you very much. Was it recorded and would we be able to review it on YouTube or somewhere?
It's recorded, yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
thank
okay.
It was a great talk. Thank you very much.
you so much.
You're welcome. Again, it was a delight. And there are a couple of concluding prayers just to dedicate the virtue, because there's a lot of virtue that we made in just thinking about this topic today. So I'll say the prayers. You're welcome to join. Sashi Boogie Joje Metal Da Rira Linjin in the Gamba Dia Sange Jingdu Metal Wagil Dogu Nanda Jinga Jaba Sho Idon Guru Rana Mandala Kamne Yatayami Gewa Dia Gewa Gun Zanam Yeja Zozo Jin Zanam Yeja Legion We Dabo Gunye Doba Sho Jean Joseph Jorimbo Ma Bana Yega Yaban Yamba Meva Yang Gone Gondu Bawa Sho Gari Rawe Goe Shingande Bendan Dewa Malu Juene Genrezi Wan Denzen Yazo Ye Jabesi De Badu Deng Yor Chi. It's good seeing everybody.
Wilson, thank you
Wilson.
so much. Have a
Thank you,
wonderful
Wilson.
Thank
day.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you very
All right.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.